as rightly pointed out, symbols, colors mean everything. They're trying to depict something that is not simply limited by human boundaries, but that it's the joining of heaven and earth, these realities coming together, even in an incarnational kind of form. Even to the point that the church building, after a while, was laid out and seen in terms of icons. So it's not only the paintings on the wall, everything becomes icon. Everything, the vestments of the clergy, the way the building is laid out is icon. In Orthodox homes, even the placement of icons through the house is an indication of the house belonging to God, and so forth. And the idea too that family is the church in miniature as well, but that this reality is not just here, but it's all over, it's wherever God's people are. And how we harmonize with that reality as being really in our face in that way. Unlike the Gothic thing where the spires point to the sky, you will see, and God willing, we're talking about building in the church. A typical Orthodox church, actually, very quickly by the 5th century, already they were developing their own style, just like art was going to change, and moving from the different styles that might be somewhat more realistic. And you actually see a blend. I'm not going to get into art history, but like some of the Egyptian styles mixed in with some of the styles from other parts of the Mediterranean start to blend in, and this is where we start to get the iconographic kind of stylizations that take place, where it's not realistic looking, somewhat, but not. But not only is it what's painted, like I said, it's everything, including the way the building is laid out. And in the beginning, when Christianity became legal, the government, good old Constantine, Constantine would give buildings to the church. I don't know how many Greek people know that the Acropolis was once upon a time a church. It was, even ironically, the temple of St. Athena, and it became the Church of St. Mary. So for a while, and then it was a mosque for a little while, during the Ottoman Turkish period for a little while. And now it's just in ruins, as anyone who went to Greece will see. But that basilica, that rectangular shaped building, was the typical, the reason it was called basilicas, to Vasilia, it was the emperor or the king's buildings. Okay? So at first, a lot of the churches, and that's how Constantine, even when you see the original churches that were built, like the original, we know the layout of the original St. Peter's, the original Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they were all kind of a basilica style, meaning that elongated kind of approach. Well, very quickly, it doesn't take more than another century or so, where as Christians are thinking through all this kind of stuff, what is it that really physically expresses the theology, the spirituality, the life of Christ that's actually present in and among us? And so rather than big spires pointing to heaven like up there, you see suddenly this idea of the dome, the idea of the dome of the heavens coming down and being down here. Almost like in a sense that the building is impregnated, it's bulging with the presence of God here. Okay? Contrary to the way Orthodox churches are laid out today, I'm going to tell you, Orthodox churches are not necessarily laid out the way they used to be laid out. Okay? I'm not going to go into the full history of what happened as to why. For instance, the Eucharist used to be distributed even to lay people like the way the clergy receive it. You receive the bread, and then you took a sip from the chalice. Everybody. And we've done that here at St. Matthew's for a few liturgies where we can do that. Part of it is when you get 60,000 people you're trying to give the Eucharist to, you try to speed it up a little bit with other ways. But the layout of the church then it was very interesting what it turned into. The table, as I said, everything centered around the table. The table that symbolized not only the table of the Last Supper, the tomb of Christ, the Ark of the Covenant, all those kinds of things that played in. Sometimes they would build, and we're talking into the 5th century, they would build a canopy. And any of you who know anything about Judaism, the canopy symbolizes the cloud. When God came and consecrated the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, the cloud that led the Israelites, the cloud that came over Solomon's temple, and so on and so forth. The presence of God that, of course, in the New Testament would overshadow the Virgin Mary, to impregnate her with the life of God himself. His direct presence on earth as in heaven. So, the table was really always central. Interestingly, the pulpit, the anvil, was really smack in the center, right under the center of the dome. Okay? That, just to let you know, that's not where sermons were preached. The anvil was to read Scripture. All the Scriptures read from the anvil. There were steps going up and steps going down. It was like a two-ended open thing. And at the end of liturgy, announcements. Okay? Like even I think to this day, because it's the Church of Alexandria that's supposed to designate the dates for Pascha, when they do the calculations, they go to the anvil and announce the date of Pascha, like in an official liturgical sense. In the back, in what was called the apse of the church, which was usually semicircular, there was what they called the synthronon. The synthronon had a chair in the middle, and it means the collective throne. Okay, synthronon. The bishop, with the bishop's presbyters, would sit. Okay, and again, this might be more, forgive a little digression, liturgy started with everybody processing in. Some of the practices we do partly stem from when we were under Turkish occupation and other things that played in. But liturgy started with what, for the Orthodox, what we call the little entrance. Okay, the gospel would be brought in. Blessed is the entrance of your holy ones. It was actually the entrance into the church. Everybody would come in together singing Holy God, Holy Mighty, Holy Immortal. That hymn was actually the procession in for everybody, led by the bishop. The bishop would come, and depending on which liturgy he was celebrating, whether it was James or Chrysostom, if he was celebrating James, he would stand at the head of the congregation with his back to the people for the first half, and sit maybe off to the side when the Scriptures were being read. After everybody was in, he'd do a peace be with you all type of thing. Scriptures would be read, and then he would move with his presbyters to the synthronon, sit down, and from there he would preach. And the presbyters were the people of the church who also were primarily the teachers. Okay, they were the teachers. And if you can imagine this, sometimes everybody would say something, commenting on the Scriptures that were read, and the bishop would kind of collect everything together and make a final comment. And then, if he was doing Chrysostom or Basil's liturgy type of thing, then he would come around with his back to the people, face and as they were leading the worship. But if he did the liturgy of James, he would start out with his back to the people, and the second half of liturgy, he'd be facing the people on the other side of the holy table. See, there used to be variety in the liturgical life of the church. Okay? Anyway, so the synthronon was actually symbolic of the enthronement of Christ. It actually, if you wanted to give it metaphorical symbolism, the earliest understandings were when the bishop with his presbyters come, the entering in was the second coming of Christ. It was the second coming. We're tasting of it now. We're all coming in together. Just as a quick FYI, the Greek word parousia, and I say this in light of all these theories about raptures and all this kind of thing, God's